So Shelby West, thank you for joining us from Pivotal Labs. I'll kind of defer to you to introduce yourself, but thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Yeah, so we're going to talk about product teams, give a little intro to what product teams are, just the group of people that work on what we call a product. So that would be some sort of software product that provides value to users. So that's what a product team itself is. I'm Shelby. I'm a product designer at VMware Pivotal Labs. Pivotal Labs was acquired last year by VMware, so a little bit of a change of name, but we still do the same thing. We are a consulting branch of VMware, which does a lot of cloud hosting services as well as platforms and all sorts of back-end things that I don't understand completely. But I am part of the consulting branch services of VMware, Pivotal Labs. So we come into different companies and help them learn how to function as a team together, how to work quickly, and how to build the right things. So doing research and contacting users and figuring out if some sort of idea for software is viable and going to provide value to people, and if there's market for it and things like that, as well as working side by side with those teams to create the software after we figure it out. So today we're going to talk through what a product team looks like. So who's involved, how do they work together, what are they responsible for, what a product manager is, and what a UX designer is. So those two other roles besides your software engineer role. We may take a break if anybody wants to after that, and then we'll get into what we at Pivotal Labs is kind of best practice for process for building a product, but we'll also go over a couple of the other methodologies to give you a good sense of how all of these roles work together, what that process could look like from the very beginning of trying to decide what to make to iterating together to build that thing. Any questions before we get started? Cool. So what does a product team look like? So it's really made up of 3 different roles. Sometimes you'll have some different titles and things underneath each of these, but these are our 3 main practices that we want to have on every single team to make sure that all of the things that we want to think about as a product is being made are accounted for, and that those people that are specialized in those areas are a part of the entire process. So the first one is engineering. So we've got our engineers, our developers, that could be leads, developers, anything like that. All of that falls underneath product engineering, and they are responsible for the technical feasibility of the product itself. Product management is going to be responsible for business needs. This could have a couple of different titles as well. You can have product managers, you can have business analysts, you can have product owners, all kind of fall under that. What does the business want to make? Is this, kind of something viable that's going to be able to be sold or solve business needs within the company? And last, you've got product design. My dog will inevitably bark at some point during this presentation. But product design is responsible for the user's needs. So we talk to and interview anybody that's going to be using that software to see what types of things they want it to do, how their processes work, as well as like the needs that they have, so that what we make actually solves some of those problems. So typically there are a lot more engineers than there are designers or product managers. So this is what we encourage as a pretty balanced team, a ratio of 6 engineers to 1 product manager and 1 product designer. This helps typically the amount of designs that a product designer and stories that a manager can write can feed about 6 engineers worth of work consistently. A lot of teams start to get bigger than this on the engineering side. It's kind of a common misconception that the more engineers you provide, the faster your team is going to go. But this is what we find to be a really good lean team that can work quickly and solve problems and not kind of be stepping on each other as they're working on a problem. So it's the size that we recommend. So why do we have all of these people involved for the entire process? And the reason is that when we have teams that are balanced and all of these practices are represented in each step, we reduce risk. So engineering is asking questions like, do we have access to the technology that we need? Can we release an MVP in the time that we have? Thinking about all of those technical feasibility questions again. Design is going to be thinking about, is our solution able to answer user needs, and is the user interface intuitive? Do they know how to use it? And then product is going to be asking those questions like, do we have a realistic revenue model? Can it make money? Are we prioritizing the right features for our users? So are we making the most valuable thing first? And so that's why we include everybody, because if you fall short on any of these, your product is not very likely to succeed. If you can't release it in the right amount of time, if nobody wants it, and if it's not providing that business value, then it's not really worth making. So we try to have all of these people in the room to make decisions. So first we'll talk through what product management as a practice looks like. I really love this quote that a great product manager has the brain of an engineer, the heart of a designer, and the speech of a diplomat. They are often the ones that are responsible for talking to stakeholders, communicating to the business itself what the vision of the product is, talking about roadmaps and how much time it's going to take and how much we're spending to create this product. This is also the role that's hardest to define. It changes at a lot of companies. Sometimes they have a lot of enablement to make decisions on their own, and sometimes they are more responsible for just coordinating with the team and prioritizing a backlog. So this one can shift quite a bit depending on where you're working, but their main responsibilities are guiding the success of the product and the team that's creating it. So they're really responsible for keeping the team moving towards a specific goal. They're going to be responsible for defining an MVP, which is minimum viable product. So that's kind of that first iteration and first stab at whatever you're going to make, the smallest thing that you can make that provides value. Next, they're going to be able to create product roadmaps. So how is our product going to change as we continue to iterate upon it? Where are we going to start, and where is our vision for where we're going to end up? What are the risks? What are the unknowns along the way that we're trying to learn? They're going to be prioritizing the backlog for their team. So creating all of those list of tasks for the developers and prioritizing them against each other to tell the development team where to start and all of the acceptance criteria for what they should be creating and how it should function. They're going to be defining the features that users should be able to accomplish. And then the developers pick those up. And then they're also responsible for those really data-driven decisions. So looking at analytics, seeing how the product is performing after you've launched, making sure that it is functioning in a good way and that people are using it, and identifying any of those pivot points based off of the data. So product managers are responsible for both the minimum viable product, which is just a donut. You can eat it. It may not be the most delicious or fancy donut, but it does serve a purpose and provides value. And they're also responsible for the other like giant pile of ridiculously fancy donuts on the other side. So thinking about what kind of donuts do people want? Do they like strawberry donuts? Do they want chocolate donuts? Do they want sprinkles on those donuts? That's the vision for where we're going next. But we're likely going to try to learn how to make a regular donut first before we start on the other side, because we can build upon a regular donut. So as an engineer, how will I interact with a PM? Product managers provide that, like I said, that prioritized list of tasks for developers to complete. So that's kind of the first step of interacting with them, is they're going to give you that list. After you take an item from that list and complete it, you're going to deliver it back to your product manager likely, because they're the ones that are responsible for making sure that it was implemented correctly and accepting that piece of work to be pushed into our code base. And then you're also going to go to the product managers for that. What am I supposed to do next question? So again, that roadmap of completion of features and all of the deadlines that go with your project. So understanding, are we on track to complete everything we need to get complete by a specific deadline? That's kind of what your product manager is also going to help you understand on a day-to-day basis. Any questions about PMs? It's a fascinating role.
You said that the ratio of the team size, is that like the typical team size as well, or is that just literally a ratio where you could have 2 PMs to 12 developers?
It's a ratio, so you could definitely have more than 1 PM to a much larger team. We encourage kind of like splitting those teams up to work on different problems if you are going to do that, so that they have different tracks of work. When your team starts to get really large, it's hard to navigate who's working on what, and keeping that many developers busy with a single backlog can be difficult. But it can be done. I've worked on teams of, 6 developers to 1 designer and 1 PM. I have also worked on teams of 20 developers with 1 designer and 1 PM, which is much more difficult, but it does happen. But it's the same type of interaction. As typically it's a list where you're going to grab that, next thing off the bottom of the top of the list, work on that. We just know that keeping clear tracks of work for different people, which I'm sure y'all are going to kind of run into with your group projects, of how do you not step on each other's feet in your code base, and how do you prioritize that work so that everything kind of comes together of what different people are working on. That can get really difficult when you've got 20 different developers working on different things. That's a lot to coordinate, whereas 6 developers all working together to provide value, they're going to get those tasks done quicker. They're going to be able to work on things, in conjunction with each other a lot easier than 20 will. So that's why we kind of encourage that size.
What's the typical background experience for product managers?
It varies. A lot of them have like business school backgrounds, but there's not really a product management degree out there. So they come from all over the place. A lot of times people will take the person that knows the most about the context within a company and make them a product manager, because they know the product domain. So if you're, working on an application for, HR, they may take one of the really senior HR managers that has known that process and interested in getting into, the tech space, and make them a product manager because they know all about their users that would be using that application. There are also a lot of developers that go into the PM role after being on a team for a long time and experiencing that, wanting to kind of dip their toe into the other side of strategy and business. PMs that have an understanding of technical aspects are huge assets to a team. The more that the PM understands the complexity behind things and how it's going to be implemented likely, the better that they can prioritize and understand how long something will take. So that kind of background and knowledge of coding can really help if you're looking to also get into the product management career path. Can definitely come from anywhere. There are designers that become PMs. I've been a PM on a project before. Not quite as fun, but.
Are PMs typically supervising the software engineers, or do the software engineers have matrixed over to a project?
Yeah, so typically engineers have their own kind of structure through IT of reporting, and the product management is typically on the business side. The product manager should not be responsible for the careers of the developer, because then it's hard to say no. We find that when one of these practices has more kind of weight than the others, it's really hard to have that honest conversation about, is this feasible? your developers should feel like you can push back on your PM on like, this is not the best way to implement this. This is not the fastest. This is not the best technology. You know, you should be able to have those really good conversations to make decisions as a team. And when the PM is the supervisor of those people, you kind of don't feel as enabled to push back on your teammates.
Would you say more often than not, PMs are like case by case, not like you're just a product manager, so then they just move you to different, products, I guess, or move you to different teams? Or is it more often you have a team and then you find a product manager?
Product management is definitely a role. You could move from one team to the next and be responsible for a different product over the years. It really depends on the company that you're going to work for and how, I would say, like tech driven they are. Like Spotify definitely has an entire team of product managers. You can shift around on which product you're assigned to. You know, they have their whole like practice neighborhood around how PMs work and the practices that they do and things like that. And so it's much more of a like core role, whereas when I worked for the Container Store, our product manager was actually just our like digital strategy team that was also in charge of the website, like sales and marketing. And so she was somebody that was, you know, kind of that domain expertise role that was then the product manager for the website of the Container Store. And so it really varies. And it really depends on like if you're in a very tech startup sort of like mindset, or if you're, you know, like maybe just more on the corporate side, it's going to vary of who that role is kind of filled by. But I hope that answers your question.
Shelby, I have a quick question. So you mentioned that product managers that have a technical, I guess, ability are kind of highly valued. So a lot of us are going to be coming from the technical side. Let's say one of us wanted to get into a product manager role. What would we need to add? Again, we would probably have the technical background, but what else does a product manager kind of have expertise in, or I guess experience in, that would make us transition towards that if we wanted to do that?
Yeah, so product management, it definitely does come from that kind of business background, but managing teams, kind of managing work and that product roadmap. I am not a product manager, so I don't know that I could list out all of the things that maybe you need to like go take a class on business or anything like that, but I have a lot of product management friends that I can get anyone in touch with if they are interested in that career field. I say the best PMs that come from dev backgrounds, typically you're rolled into that based off of working with a development team as a developer usually, and then kind of like getting interest in that and taking on a little more of the responsibility of working with the PMs to write stories and help creating that product roadmap and then showing interest. That's how I've seen most developers kind of shift into that. But a lot of PMs that I work with are just, if you've got good, you know, people skills, you can make presentations, you can, you know, roadmap and have a good understanding of how technical things work and the process behind it. Usually you can get a pretty good entry level position. It's much more about that interview and your kind of coordination skills. Obviously, if you've done this kind of role, I would encourage you to, if you're interested in it, I'd encourage you to like try to take that on for your group projects. That's a great example of like a portfolio piece where you're helping put all of that team together and helping prioritize. I think that typically with the group projects, you'll try to identify somebody to kind of like own the backlog and the tasks and coordinating people. So if you're interested in that.
Are they still like recommending product managers to do things like Scrum Masters and stuff like that? Or is those not popular anymore?
So in some teams, you definitely have Scrum Masters as well. They are responsible for the like Agile practice of a team. So making sure they're pointing correctly, running all of this Scrum ceremonies like stand up and backlog grooming and things like that. So they're less responsible for, a product manager is responsible for the success of the product. If it's not successful, the PM is definitely not doing their job. Or the PM is not identifying where it's not going correctly. But a Scrum Master is much more responsible for the health of the team. So sometimes you'll see that person also incorporated. We'll go over a little bit of like the Scrum versus Lean versus other things, and a little farther along in the presentation of how those different kind of ways of working interact with each other. But yes, those are two pretty different roles. Sometimes a PM is responsible for like running the backlog grooming and things like that, that sometimes a Scrum Master might be. So they overlap a little bit, but where they differ is, you know, that PM is really responsible for the business of the product itself, rather than a Scrum Master who's responsible for the team's health and that they are working efficiently. Different metrics you would measure those positions by. You don't always have a Scrum Master. You will probably always have some sort of representation of a product manager or business stakeholder or product owner or business analyst, something like that for the business side. Scrum Master is kind of a nice to have for some teams. Cool. If there are no more questions about PMs, I'll move on to design, which I know a lot more about. Awesome. Okay. Product design, also called UX design. There's a lot of different titles for designers these days, and all of them vary a little bit in what the responsibilities are of a UX designer versus a product designer. But I'm going to talk through product design because it's the most encompassing of all of them. But first, just like, what is user experience? This is a question that I get asked a lot as a UX designer, is nobody really knows what this actually is. It's more than what a website looks like. This is kind of common misconception, is just that designers make things look pretty. We are responsible for making it look pretty, but it's a little bit more than that. So we're responsible for how users interact with a website as well. So this is a pretty good example of bad UX, is you designed something the way that you wanted it to work, but people are going to use it the way that they want to, so they've created their own path. The UX designer's job is to do that research beforehand to figure out what those paths are that users want to do and how they want to use something before designing, so that we design the right thing. So our responsibilities are defining the needs of the users. So doing a lot of user interviews and ethnographic studies to really understand and build empathy with the user. We want to be able to think like them and understand their habits and what's driving their needs. User interviews could be anything from looking at how somebody currently uses their programs, asking them a lot of questions about their role and their process and what they want to do with the software that we're creating. Ethnographic studies are a little more of a like backseat study. You go and observe someone in their natural habitat. It's a very anthropological type of study. They do this for a lot of different types of anthropology, but we do it for UX also. We go and I've worked on a project with the Air Force before where I spent 3 days on a flight line just watching airmen do maintenance on aircraft. And extremely interesting seeing the parts of their day that are really frustrating, how they interact with their other team members, and those different points of the day where software could make improvements. And that's kind of why we were there. We talked to them, we'd ask them a couple of questions when things came up, but we were really there to observe their current process and where we thought software could intervene and provide value. So that's what an ethnographic study is. Personas are generalizations of users. And so a lot of times you'll have big bucket groups of kind of people that are going to be commonly using your application, and we create personas based off of those. So these are some demographics the needs, the pain points that are really common across a lot of people. So this might be by a role for a team that you're making a product for. There may be a leadership persona where we know that they need to, account for the actions of their team, and that a common pain point for all of the, managers is that they don't know what their teams are doing day to day for each person, or their communication is difficult, things like that. So trying to kind of find those common threads across all of the user interviews to identify some like central points for each person to create all of that empathy. And then prototype creation. So this is what everybody thinks that we do, is just what does it look like? How does it function? How do the buttons look? What do hovers look like? Should the corners be rounded? Should there be a stroke on everything? What font are we using? And how do all of our pages interact with each other? And how do you flow from one to the next? So pretty wide variety of responsibilities for designers.
Sorry, before you move on, what would you say is the time split on those things? Are they really in that order in time or just importance?
Those are kind of the process order. So when I am starting a project, I'm going to do a lot of that user interviews up front, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. I'm going to create those personas from those user interviews, and then I'm going to go into prototype creation based off of what I've learned. And then you kind of circle back in the design process saying, now I have this prototype, I'm going to go back and I'm going to interview users again and see what they think about my prototype. And I'm going to let them mess with it and just watch them use it. I'm going to update all of those needs that I understand about users, and then I'm going to create a new design based off of everything that I've learned. So it's not so much about time. I spend probably my most time doing like 50-50 user interviews and prototype creation and back and forth on those. The other things are sometimes like really pointed and targeted research studies for those ethnographic studies, and the persona definitions. It's usually like a day at the beginning of the project to outline who our users are going to be, and then we update it throughout the process. But I'd say user interviews and prototype creation are probably those two really big time responsibilities from a designer. Any other questions about responsibilities for design? Sweet. So how will I interact with a designer? So when I'm creating designs, I a lot of times ask my developers to come and sit with me while I'm designing to see that technical feasibility. So I can ask questions like, are you going to hate me if I design it this way? Is this really difficult to implement? I like to build that relationship with my developers so that it's a compromise of, what do I think the best design is going to be and the best experience versus what is the best implementation that's going to get something fast of value. And so developers really help me understand the effort behind implementing my designs. And then designers are going to provide a prototype of that product and attach it in with all of that list items that your product manager created. So for each of those tasks that have a front end item, there should be a design that goes with it. And the designer is responsible for kind of talking to that, usually in the backlog grooming, making sure that the team understands that design. So you should be able to ask your designer questions about what their experience is intended to be, kind of how they want things to function. If they didn't outline everything, which it's really hard to as a designer to say, every single button on the page, what it's going to look like if you hover on it and click on it and all these different things. So working with your designers to define some common patterns and things that you can implement. So that's during the work process that you'll interact with them. And then after you're done with your features, typically your developers and designers pair to make sure that what you've created in code matches what the designer's vision for the experience looks like. And so it's our jobs to be super picky and notice very tiny little design flaws. And so a lot of times when I work with developers, they're like, how did you even see that? I didn't even notice that was the wrong font. So we just sit side by side and kind of look at what you've made and make sure that it matches what the design was intended to be. I like to have a kind of 80% level of expectation of like, if we can get it to that like 80% there, that's usually good enough to get the story accepted, and be flexible on it. Obviously isn't going to be pixel perfect every single time. And most designers are that way, where what we've created, we know is like a very high expectation for styling. And so working side by side to make sure that it's not hindering the experience with anything that doesn't match the design.
Question for you.
Yeah.
Are you involved in like CSS creation or are you, or is that like outside your function?
Yeah, most designers you work with do not know how to code. That's going to be kind of a very blanket statement, as most designers don't code. I know a little bit of CSS. I can. Sometimes I do pairing sessions with developers where I'll come in and also put some code in there with the help and hand holding of my pair to make sure I don't break anything else. But sometimes it's easier for me to go in and be like, I just want to adjust the spacing to see how it looks, because it looks a little differently now that it's on the screen, or the way that the font is rendering in the browser versus in my design tool is different. So I want to adjust the spacing to see kind of where it feels correct. But most designers do not code. They will provide you, and I'll show you some examples of things that designers will provide a little bit later as well, some of the tools that we use and kind of how you'll interact with a design and translating that into the CSS front-end code.
Is there a person who kind of sits in that role in between the designer and the developers, who basically their whole role is look and feel of buttonology and things? So they're basically creating your palette versus actually using the buttons to build a specific page.
Yeah. So a lot of times some developers will decide that they want to specialize in front end, so that, you know, like CSS, HTML creation of pages, and like loving React or one of those, you know, platforms that are really great for front end development. And so I work with some of the developers like that want to be responsible for creating a library for the other developers to grab and drop so that all of the components are consistent. So they create a button that every developer can then reference after that. So there are, like, it just depends on what your interests are as a developer. If you really enjoy the front end and kind of that, you know, pixel perfect design of creating something and that's reusable, there's absolutely the opportunity for that on a lot of teams. And I know a lot of teams are excited when somebody is, you know, really interested in the front end and are like, yes, please take that. And so, yeah, I have a lot of developers on my team, or not a lot. I have 2 developers on my team that love the front end, and that we constantly sit down together and look over the library that we've created, and kind of how we can tweak things and how we can provide better assets for our developers, so that when we implement something, it looks consistent and feels consistent, and so that we're saving time on coding. There's no reason for every single person to recode a million times the styles for a single button. So
Yeah. Thanks.
yeah, no problem. Any other questions? We're going to dive into how projects kind of flow and how each of these roles work together next. Cool. We're taking a little longer than normal. Does anybody want a 5-minute break? We can do like a quick Roman vote of, if you want to keep going, thumbs up. I've got a background on. If you want to take a break, thumbs down. So ready, set, throw. I'm seeing keep going. I'm seeing a couple take a break though. So let's take a 5-minute break, or maybe 4 minutes. Circle back at 6:15-ish. That's a 6-minute. That's a 5-minute break. 6:15. Cool. See you guys then. If you're back from break, if everybody turns their cameras back on, we're going to go ahead and get started again. All right. Okay. So the process, how do we make things? There's a lot of different processes for creating software, and every company is a little bit different in what they say they're doing versus what they're actually doing. There's a lot of people that have very, very opinionated thoughts on what you should be doing, but there's a lot of them. So we're going to go through a couple. No team works the same way. Every place that I've ever worked at, it works just a little bit different, and none of them are wrong in the way that they're creating what they're making. But waterfall is going to be like the bad word in the tech industry. It's if you're doing waterfall, you're doing it wrong. But there are some pros to it. Waterfall is a really linear process for creating software. It goes through each step individually and doesn't encourage collaboration across all of those three practices that we've talked about so much. So the PMs are going to start with requirements and analysis of the market. They're going to build all of that. I've literally seen binders worth of requirements for what a product should be based off of all of this analysis. They then hand that binder over to the designer and say, make my dreams come true. And design spends months looking at really grand designs for software of what the biggest, best thing that we could possibly make is. And then we design that, we do a lot of research, and then we pass that design off to the developers. They go through coding and implementation. They then pass it off to probably a QA team that tests it like crazy after it's all built. Then it goes through a deployment process, and then eventually a team maintains it afterwards. But there's not a lot of circling back to make sure that we got something right. And that we built the right thing. So this focuses on completing a full set of features before releasing. So pros are that each practice really gets to focus on what they're doing, and they get a lot of time. So design gets to think really big about what this should be and create really cool, fancy designs. And it focuses on all of those feature sets. So it ends with a pretty big product. Cons, it takes a lot longer, and the longer that we wait to release, the higher the risk that we made the wrong thing is, and that the product isn't relevant. Someone else could have released it, a different product that's exactly the same as yours because you took too long. So Agile is kind of that first step into, we want to do an iterative process. So it's continuous, it focuses on iterating in sprints, so specific timeframes set aside. It's usually 2 weeks for a team to commit to what they're going to develop. They plan that, they design that, they develop it, test it, they get feedback, and all of that loops around in kind of these consistent timeframes so that we're getting feedback consistently. So this definitely reduces the risk. And it's easy to switch focus to a new task if in the feedback we decide, hey, that was the wrong thing to build. At least we only spent a couple of weeks on it, and we can pivot really quickly. Cons here are that sprints can be really restrictive to the release process. You only get to release at the end of a sprint, and that's only every 2 weeks. So you can't get feedback as fast as you could if you were just consistently releasing. So what we do at Pivotal Labs is we really focus on a lean practice. So this is really focused around build, learn, and measure. So we do this loop of gathering ideas, building. We then get a product out of that build. We measure it, we get data, and we learn from the data. And then that produces new ideas, which we use to build and just continue this loop. This isn't focused on any amount of time, and we try to enable the team to do these 3 things as fast as possible. So we could do week iterations, we could get something, create it within a couple of days, test it with users, and learn from that as fast as possible. So we want to make sure that we're reducing the risk as much as we can that we're building the wrong thing. So that feedback loop is really important. So pros, again, further we're reducing the risk that we're providing something that doesn't deliver value. Cons is this process can feel really unstructured to a lot of teams, and it may not be viable for a more corporate environment. We work with a lot of really big corporate clients at labs, and a lot of times our teams are really thrown off by this process because it goes really fast, and there's not as many people involved, and the teams are enabled to make decisions on their own. And so planning for what you're going to be doing, you know, a month or two down the line can be difficult when you're just constantly learning and building. You should create something faster that has more value than what you would have if you had taken more time. But it can be a little daunting for some of those places that like more planning and structure. So there are some principles that go with lean of what we try to focus on as we do this process, and it's eliminating waste, empowering the team. So again, making sure that they can make those decisions so they can move as fast as possible, delivering fast, optimizing the whole. So making sure that what we do have is as optimized as possible. We're building quality in. So we want to build a good product, not just a quick product. We want to defer decisions until the last possible moment. So if we don't have to make that decision right now, we're absolutely not going to spin our wheels on it. We're going to punt it down the line, and we're going to amplify our learning. So that's kind of the most important of everything that we learn should be communicated to the team and quickly incorporated into what our product is. So this is one of my kind of just favorite visuals that we show clients a lot of why they should be doing some sort of agile, lean, iterative process over waterfall. And the idea here is that every time we release and learn something, we're reducing that risk. So over time, we're going to learn so many times that we reduce that risk every time, and we keep it at a pretty low level. Whereas waterfall, if you're only releasing here, this amount of risk, if you had identified right here that you're building the wrong product, you spent so much time creating something that was wrong, that you should have created something else. And so that's a lot of time and money that you can save by getting that consistent feedback loop. All right, so life cycle of a project. This is Pivotal Labs' discovery and framing process. This is kind of what we go through with our clients to really quickly, within like 8 to 12 weeks, create a product. And this process works pretty good, but every single place you work is going to be a little bit different of how they decide where to start and what to make and what your requirements are. But this is the one that we think works really well. So this is what we call the double diamond. Discovery, framing, and iterations are 3 of the kind of sections of the process. In discovery, we're trying to figure out what problem we're solving. And the diamond idea is that we're going to go really wide and search for all of the problems that we could solve. And then we're going to narrow those down and prioritize the biggest problem that we need to solve. For framing, we're going to do the same thing. This is where we decide what solutions we want to apply to that problem. So we're going to generate many, many solutions, and then we're going to narrow it down into the one solution that's going to provide the most value for that solving that initial problem. And then development starts, and we're going to do all of those iterations of that lean method of build, measure, learn. So we're going to continue user research, but development is going to start building things so that we can start testing with real software. So discovery, we're going to talk a little bit about what each practice does during each of these items. So for discovery, design and product are going to be responsible for going really wide, interviewing a lot of people, trying to figure out everybody that's involved in this kind of product area and domain, and outlining all of those flows, current processes, pain points, and understanding that problem space. Developers are also going to be involved, though. They're not just going to, sit at the side. They're going to start defining the feasibility of creating the product and any technical risks. So anything that's going to be something that's going to be a high amount of effort, or things that we should think about, or current systems we need to plug into, things like that. What's our accessibility to this data? What does that data look like? Starting to do a lot of research on their own side. For framing, design and product, again, are going to kind of pair together to start thinking about what this actually looks like. This could be wireframes for a design. This can be a product roadmap. But we're going to start narrowing down on what it is we are making. When we think about going really wide with a problem, of understanding all of the different ways we could solve that problem, thinking about, like, if the problem that we had identified was communication, they're having a really big problem with communication. They don't have good tools to communicate across a team. We're going to go really wide and say, okay, what are all the different ways that you could communicate? And we're going to think about all of them. We're going to think about, chat messaging. We're going to think about email. We're going to think about phone calls. We're going to think about carrier pigeons, everything you could possibly communicate with. And then we're going to say, okay, well, they really need like real-time communication. They can't have face-to-face. They're in meetings a lot of times. So something like Slack, something like chat is going to work best for that solution. So identifying those problems and user needs and then narrowing down to something. That's what the framing process is about. Developers are going to start to define that framework. They're going to do technical spikes. So maybe throwaway code to try to solve some of those really big problems that we've identified as risks earlier. To see like just what we're getting ourselves into. They're also probably going to start setting up all of the like platform for where we're hosting everything, all of the really back-end technical DevOps kinds of stuff too. I've got some sirens going on in the background. So the way that we want to start thinking about what our MVP for our product is this kind of triangle of all of the things that you can provide when you're building a product. So the first step is something is functional, and this typically takes the most amount of time to set up for an entire product. So it's the base of the pyramid. Next is that that thing is also reliable. Next is that it's usable. And then the last is that it's delightful. So all these things take, a little bit less time as you're implementing to make something completely delightful. But we only get so much money and time to create our first round of products. And so we don't want to fill in our pyramid on the bottom of creating a lot of features that are barely functional. We want to fill in all the way up to the top of what we call a thin slice. So we want to make one feature and we want to make it really good, because it's way more likely that someone's going to give us more money to make the next feature if they loved the first one. So that's how we prioritize what you should work on first, is something that is really high value, and we want to do it extremely well. We want it to be delightful to use. And that's how a lot of, these really big companies and apps get started. If you think about Google, it was very simple at first. It was just a search to find things on the internet. And they did that awesome. And now look at them. I'm using slides. That's ridiculous. They got a lot more money. Facebook, just, a profile with some posts initially. Now they've got messaging services and dating apps and, a marketplace where you can sell your couch on. But they did one thing really well first so that people wanted to use them and got attached to their app. So that's why we try to strategize this way. So then the last step is that build begins. Building is going to start. Iterations are the last step. Product is really going to outline that roadmap. They're going to build that backlog of work. They're going to communicate out what our first iteration is going to look like and what that MVP is. Design's going to deliver prototype screens and attach them to that backlog. So what should this look like? How should it function? Who is it for? And development's going to research that path to production to make sure that we can actually release something. During this, there are all of these wonderful tools that you can use to create designs that you might see from designers. And so this is where I'm gonna just quickly show you guys some, because I know we're at the end of our time. Envision is gonna give you a clickable prototype that looks like an app. So animations, things like that. You can make something look really real. These are just pictures that I have strung together, basically a really fancy PowerPoint. But we use this for user testing. We show these to people to get their opinions on an app before we've built it. This is also sometimes how you'll get designs from designers. So it's got this nifty inspect mode that will give you all of the kind of CSS code here if you want it. The styles, you can copy and paste all of your text out of here. You can see spacing, grab assets, things like that. So InVision is great for that. Figma is an actual design tool. So this is where like I'd actually decide how big boxes are. And sometimes you'll get access to this file as well with Figma. Sometimes designers just give access to the developer so that they can come in here and say, okay, this is Roboto, size 15. This is the color of it. You can come in here and see the spacing also if you hold down specific keys. So yeah, so these are a couple of the tools. Miro is also another tool that I use for the kind of discovery and framing process. It's a virtual whiteboard. It's incredible. I would definitely recommend it for your teams for group projects if you need like a planning space. It's got virtual sticky notes. It's got a lot of different templates for discovery exercises and things like that, Kanban boards, all of that. It's wonderful. It's also free for like your first 3 boards. And I think Figma is also free for your first project. So use those as you want to for your individual and other projects. Last is iterations. We're going to speed through this. Developers are going to work all of those stories. Product is going to approve all of the work and keep prioritizing. Design's going to gather feedback on what's being made, which is going to return new stories and new ideas being put into the backlog, which kind of completes out this entire project, this entire process. Iterations last as long as the product is alive and needs new things. Constantly getting feedback, constantly improving on it. Nothing is ever perfect. So typically a product team sticks around for a long time. They don't just stop when it's done and then go to the next thing. So balanced teams support each other. That's why we include everybody in the process. It's important to have all of these voices in the room as we go through every step of it to make sure that we're making something that provides value, that people are going to like, that meets business needs and is technically feasible to create. And that's all I've got. Questions? We are a little bit over time. I'm happy to stay, but I also know that you guys probably want to get off of Zoom because you've been on all day long. So yeah. Any last questions, or I will absolutely not be offended if people hop off and say goodbye.
You
Did
mentioned,
make all the,
sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna ask, did you make all the designs for your slides? Because they look really good.
I did, thank you. I did. I grabbed some resources from work, but yeah, I do design my own slides.
You mentioned the lean process not having like required release dates. Do they typically have a typical, like they stick to a single release cycle, or will that just be cycle by cycle to determine this one's only going to be a week versus the next one will be longer or whatever?
Yeah, so we don't do cycles in a particular time frame at all. When a story is done, it gets released to production, and we rely on our test-driven development practice to ensure that our code is up to date, that nothing's going to break when we release it, and so everything just gets released when it's done, which provides value to users faster, rather than waiting until the end of like a really big chunk of work to release every time. Once it can provide value, we release it. We also do all of our iteration planning meetings, which are the same as like backlog groomings and things like that on a as needed schedule. So we typically schedule them every week, but we'll have them ad hoc in between that as well as soon as we run out of work that is pointed. So it's much more flexible of whatever the team needs and how fast we're moving is how fast we're going to go. And we're going to have all of our ceremonies whenever we need them rather than scheduled weekly or things like that. We're going to really listen to that like need of the team and the heartbeat of how fast we're going. So rather than just relying on every 2 weeks, we need to get this amount of stuff done.
Can you walk through pointing a story?
Yeah. Let's see here. So do I have a little tracker? Oh, I spelled that wrong. Oops, sorry. I might not be logged in for this. So how a story gets written is typically, I'm gonna have to sign in with my VPN to do that. So you would write a story. Let's see, I can just do this again here. As given, when, then. So a story is going to provide all of the acceptance criteria for what needs to happen, what a user needs to be able to do to complete that feature. So we're going to say like, given I'm on the home page, when I click the print button, then the browser print dialog opens. So as a team, we're going to decide what kind of level we're going to go through, or what pointing structure we're going to have. Our teams typically do a 1, 2, 3 t-shirt size for complexity type of pointing. So everybody on the team would look at this. We would look at the design for it. We'd take into account, you know, how many browsers do we support with our application? And you'd say, you know what, this is something that is either a small amount of complexity, meaning, you know what, I got this, I know exactly how to do it, I've done it before, it's gonna, you know, be super easy. Medium, which would be a 2, which is like, you know, I think this is pretty easy. I maybe have never done it before. I need to go research some things, but I know that this is something that almost every website does. So I can probably find some pretty good, you know, documentation on how to implement it. Versus a 3, which would be a really large effort, which is like, there are a lot of unknowns about this. Nobody's ever created a print button before. Do browsers even have that kind of dialogue? We don't know. So that's kind of how pointing structures are going to work. We go through backlog planning or iteration planning. Every team is going to call it something different, where your PMs are responsible for writing all of these up and deciding what's in a story, and then they present it to the development team and they point those stories. So you'd say, okay, on 3, you know, everybody's going to hold up to their camera what they think the effort is to do this, and they'd say 1, 2, 3. And then they're going to look at everybody, and the team is going to come to a consensus of what they want to point that story as. The thing I cannot stress enough is that it's an estimation, and developers suck at estimating work. So it's never going to be exactly correct, but you suck so consistently at estimating work that it all works out in the end. So yeah, it's just a way for the team to have a conversation about how difficult a piece of work is, if it needs to be broken out into multiple stories. You know, just there's a lot that goes into it, and everybody has a different understanding of how they would implement. So it does get a little bit fuzzy, which is why we try not to do the entire like Fibonacci sequence, but some teams do. But it's just about having that conversation. It's about being able to understand, okay, well, if all of our stories are really big unknown stories, we probably can't get through as many of them very quickly as we could, you know, a bunch of stories like maybe a print button. So it helps us understand what level of complexity we're trying to get done, maybe how much time it might take, depending on, you know, how much we've gotten done in the past and referencing that. But we try to not associate points with time.
Thanks. I've seen various point structures, and I definitely like points not equaling time, because
Yes.
it never works out.
No, you have no idea how much that's going to take, but you can say, that's why the t-shirt size for understanding complexity, we find is the easiest to get an entire team on the same page with. A lot of the teams that I've worked with that do the Fibonacci, which is like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. The difference between a 1 and a 2 is trivial, and nobody understands what it really should be. So they just kind of like go to a 2, or I don't know why I pointed that a 1, versus a 13. And so that's where we find the like really easy to understand definitions of 1, 2, and 3 and make it way easier to get the entire team pointing consistently and having that conversation, rather than saying, well, I pointed at a 2 because of like this really small thing versus I pointed at a 1 because of, like I've done that before. The t-shirt sizes help just have the conversation around, the actual complexity of the work versus why a 1 and a 2 are different, which I have had many times over the years with teams of what the difference between a 1 and a 2 are. So.
Thanks a bunch.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? I am on y'all's Slack. Please feel free to reach out. I will give y'all the exact same opportunity as I give every other cohort that I work with. If you reach out to me, I would be happy to hear your pitch for your individual or group projects. I've helped a lot of the other teams with prioritizing and narrowing down features, color palettes. I don't do specifically like this is what your design should be, because if I did that for every person, it would take me all day, every day. But I am happy to, help understand what you're trying to make and help you prioritize maybe how you should implement it, like a PM would, so that you're implementing something that provides value along the way, or if you don't get to the end of it, you still have a really good app. So a lot of the people that I have worked with have won Best in Show at the end of all of the projects. So book your time quickly. But yeah, message me, find me on LinkedIn. Happy to talk about how to be a PM or how to be a designer. If anyone is interested in those career fields, they're pretty rad. But yeah, other than that, if there are no more questions, I'll let you guys go.
All right. Shelby, thanks again for taking your time, sharing your expertise on product teams. I think design is a really cool field. I like front-end development and designing applications. So yeah, great that you provide your contact information. So again, if you guys are interested in learning more about design or just having your project reviewed, Shelby, we definitely appreciate you offering your support there. Yeah, hopefully everyone kind of learned about product teams. Maybe you have an inclination, if you want to be a project manager or a designer, definitely pursue those roles if they work for you. All right, Shelby, thanks again for coming in and presenting for us today. Rest of November Platoon, we'll see you guys tomorrow then. All right, have a good evening, everyone. Thanks again, Shelby.
Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you.